Lone Tree, Texas. 1882. The heat here doesn't just burn your skin, it suffocates you, pressing down like the weight of a hanging judge's gavel. On the rotting wooden porch of the last independent ranch in the valley, Jane stood perfectly still. The dust swirling around her boots carried the scent of dry earth and impending death. 3 riders sat on their horses 10 yards away. They had come for the deed to her land, the rights to the creek, and if she refused, they had come for her life. "You can't hold us all off, widow," the lead rider spat, his horse nervously stomping the cracked dirt. "Declan wants this valley. Law says it's his." Jane didn't flinch. Her knuckles were bone white around the lever of her Winchester rifle. She was a woman who had already lost a husband to this unforgiving frontier. She had nothing left to lose but the roof over her head, and she was ready to bleed for it. But the real reason the riders' horses were nervously backing up wasn't the trembling widow. It was the man in the shadows. He sat on a chopping block at the far end of the porch, wearing a dust-caked canvas coat. He didn't hold a gun. He was just a drifter, a man named Holt, whom she had taken in 2 days ago for a warm meal. His hands were thick and calloused, scarred with the deep, faded powder burns of a man whose whole life was measured in bullets. Slowly, Holt drove a splitting axe into a pine log. The heavy thud echoed across the dead yard, sharp and final as a coffin nail. I didn't speak. He just looked up, and in that cold, hollow stare, the 3 riders saw a graveyard. The lead man swallowed his pride and pulled his reins. "We'll be back tonight," he growled, "with fire." As the riders disappeared into the red haze, the silence returned, heavier than before. Jane lowered her rifle, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at the stranger, a man clearly broken, running from a war of his own, a man who looked like he needed saving just as much as she did. Holt pulled the axe from the wood, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon. I had ridden 1,000 miles to escape the killing. Now, as the sun began to bleed into the western sky, the choice was his. Saddle his horse and vanish into the desert, or stay and let the devil find him one last time. Inside the dim light of the cabin, the silence was thicker than the stew Jane set on the rough-hewn table. Holt ate methodically, his eyes fixed on the worn wood, avoiding the gaze of the woman sitting across from him. She didn't ask about the scars on his hands. He didn't ask about the empty chair at the head of the table. In the West, you don't pry open old wounds unless you're prepared to deal with the bleeding. "It's not just the land Declan is after," Jane finally said, her voice steady but frayed at the edges. "It's the water." She pulled out a crumpled, yellowed survey map, sliding it across the table. "A legal loophole," she explained bitterly. "The lawyers for the syndicate found an ambiguity in the survey boundary lines, giving them full jurisdiction over Redstone Creek." Holt glanced at the map, then back to his plate. "The law is just a rich man's tool," he muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It means every small rancher in this valley is taking water they no longer legally own," Jane continued, ignoring his cynicism. "They starved the others out, broke their spirits, bought their deeds for pennies." She leaned forward, the flickering lantern light catching the fierce, desperate gleam in her eyes. "My ranch is the bottleneck, the only piece of the creek they don't completely control. If I sign, the whole valley dies of thirst." Holt slowly wiped his mouth. "Then you sell. You take the money and you survive." "This is my home," she fired back, the tremor in her voice giving away the fear she fought so hard to bury. "My husband bled into this soil. I won't let them take it." Holt stood up, casting a long, dark shadow against the wall. He had seen this before, good people clinging to dirt until it became their grave. I wanted no part of it, but when morning broke, the choice was stripped away from both of them. Jane stepped onto the porch, her coffee cup shattering on the floorboards. The creek that ran through her property, the lifeblood of her livestock and her livelihood, had run completely dry. Upstream, Declan's men had dammed the water. The thirst of the wolves had begun. The town of Lone Tree. High noon. Holt rode into the dusty settlement for supplies, keeping his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the quiet streets like a hunted animal. But the trouble wasn't looking for him. It had already found the only man who still believed in the law. Through the dirty glass of the sheriff's office, Holt watched the brutal dismantling of justice. Declan's enforcers hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to send a message to anyone thinking a tin star still meant something in this valley. 2 men held Sheriff Boone down, while a third went to work with cold, clinical precision. They didn't kill him. That would have brought the federal marshals down on the syndicate. Instead, they broke his right arm, snapping the bone with a sickening crack, and fractured 2 of his ribs. They took his badge and his service revolver, leaving the 54-year-old lawman bleeding on his own floor. Holt stood across the street, hidden in the shadows of the general store porch. His hand hovered over his empty hip, phantom muscle memory twitching for a heavy Colt that wasn't there. I saw Boone drag himself toward the doctor's clinic, clutching his shattered arm, his badge gone. Every instinct Holt possessed, every violent impulse he had spent years trying to bury, screamed at him to cross the street and settle the score. But he turned away. He forced himself to walk back to his horse. I wasn't a hero anymore. I was just a ghost. And ghosts don't bleed for other people's wars. He rode back to Jane's ranch, convincing himself he would pack his bags and leave before the sun set. But Declan's wolves weren't satisfied with breaking the law. They wanted to break the widow. Midnight at the Lone Tree Ranch. The smell of smoke woke Holt before the screaming of the horses did. He kicked open the bunkhouse door to find the night sky glowing a hellish orange. The main barn was fully engulfed in flames, a roaring inferno set by cowards in the dark. Jane was already running toward the blaze, her nightgown billowing like a white phantom against the fire. "The horses!" she screamed, covering her face as she plunged into the thick, choking smoke. Holt didn't think. The self-preservation that had kept him alive for a decade evaporated in a fraction of a second. He charged into the burning barn. The heat was blinding, the air completely sucked out of the room. Jane was struggling with the terrified animals, trying to blindfold a frantic roan mare. Above them, a burning wooden support beam groaned, giving way with a deafening crack. Holt lunged, throwing his weight against the falling timber. His bare hands seared against the blazing wood, the flesh blistering instantly. But he held it up just long enough. "Go!" he roared over the roar of the fire. Jane drove the horses out into the cool night air, and Holt collapsed onto the dirt behind her, gasping for breath as the barn roof finally caved in. Outside, illuminated by the dying embers, she knelt beside him in the dust. She took his burned, trembling hands in hers, her fingers stained with soot and his blood. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and their ragged breathing. They looked at each other. No words of gratitude were spoken. Out here, love isn't confessed in whispers. It's forged in the fires of survival. In her eyes, he saw a woman who would rather burn than surrender. And in his, she saw a killer waking up. The message from Declan was clear. The barn tonight, the house tomorrow. Holt looked down at his blistered hands. They were no longer fit for chopping wood, but they could still pull a trigger. Dawn broke over the Lone Tree Ranch, casting long, gray shadows across the smoking ruins of the barn. The scent of charred wood and burnt hay hung heavy in the cold morning air, a bitter reminder of the wolves circling their prey. On the porch, Holt was packing his weathered saddlebags. His blistered hands moved stiffly, securing the leather straps with practiced mechanical efficiency. I was doing what he had always done when the blood started flowing. He was running. He tried not to look at Jane, but he could feel her presence at the edge of the porch. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging him to stay. In the West, you don't ask a man to fight a war that isn't his. Instead, she sat in the rocking chair, her face smudged with soot, calmly pushing brass cartridges into the loading gate of her Winchester rifle. The metallic click-clack of the action was the loudest sound in the yard, a steady rhythm of defiance. Holt slung his bags over his dark roan horse and finally met her eyes. He wanted to tell her she was being a fool, that dirt and wood weren't worth dying for, but the fierce, unbreakable resolve in her gaze silenced him. She looked at him not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that cut deeper than any blade. "They'll kill you, Jane," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They can try," she replied softly, racking around into the chamber. Holt swung up into the saddle. He tipped his hat, a final hollow gesture of respect, and spurred his horse toward the eastern trail. As the dust kicked up behind him, he didn't look back. But the image of the widow, sitting alone on her porch, waiting for the devil with a loaded rifle, was already burning a hole in his soul. 3 miles outside of town, the trail arched over a high, rocky ridge that looked down onto the settlement of Lone Tree. Holt pulled back on the reins, bringing his horse to a halt. The wind howled through the scrub brush, carrying the faint, metallic scrape of shovels hitting hard dirt. He pulled his spyglass from his coat pocket and peered down into the town square. Declan's men weren't at the saloon. They were in the center of the plaza, digging a hole deep enough for a man to stand in, and Sheriff Boone, battered and bound, was kneeling beside it. Holt lowered the glass. His chest tightened. He had spent 10 years trying to outride his demons, leaving a trail of blood and regrets across the frontier. He had told himself that avoiding the fight made him a better man, but looking down at the terrified town and thinking of the woman waiting alone to die on her porch, he finally understood. Running didn't bring peace. It just left the innocent to pay the toll. Holt climbed down from the saddle. He walked to the back of his horse and untied a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle that he hadn't opened since he arrived. His blistered fingers peeled back the canvas, revealing a heavy-barreled Colt .45 and a worn gun belt. The metal was cold, oiled. This was the point of no return, the exact moment a man stops pretending to be a lamb and remembers he was born a wolf. He strapped the simple, dark leather holster to his right thigh, securing it with a frayed rawhide cord. He'd spun the cylinder, checking the loads. Every click was a promise. Every bullet was a verdict. Holt mounted his horse, not as a drifter running from his past, but as a reckoning riding straight toward it. He turned his horse away from the eastern trail, aiming it down the steep descent into the heart of Lone Tree. The square of Lone Tree was completely empty, save for a fresh mound of earth and 3 men with shovels who couldn't stop laughing. Sheriff Boone was buried in the hard ground up to his neck. His face was caked with dirt, his eyes wide with a defiant agony that was costing him everything he had. Declan stood over him, pressing the heel of his polished boot into the loose soil, feeling the earth heave as the old lawman struggled to draw a breath. "This is the sound of the law in Lone Tree now," Declan announced, his voice smooth and patient, echoing off the wooden storefronts. "I was speaking to the entire town, though not a single soul was visible. The residents watched in paralyzed terror from behind drawn curtains and locked doors. They were bearing witness to the territory's justice being buried alive in their own plaza." "Shovel another foot of dirt on him," Declan ordered, adjusting his tailored coat. Let him think about his jurisdiction for a while. Then, the cruel laughter abruptly died. From the eastern edge of the plaza, a shadow detached itself from the blinding midday glare. Nobody had heard him arrive. Nobody knew where he came from. Holt rode his dark roan stallion at a slow, deliberate walk, sitting in the saddle with the eerie stillness of an object that had always been there, like a fence post or a shadow. His horse stopped at the edge of the square and stood perfectly motionless. No shifting of weight, no tossing of its head. It was a horse trained to wait for a signal, completely unbothered by the smell of death. Holt's hands rested lightly on the saddle horn, the deep powder burns visible on his knuckles. The drifter who had ridden away to save his own skin had returned, and he hadn't come to negotiate. Declan turned his attention to the lone rider. His expression didn't change. He possessed the supreme, quiet confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that calculated violence couldn't solve. Holt dismounted slowly, moving with that same eerie calmness. He didn't look at Declan, nor at the armed men flanking him. His cold eyes were locked entirely on the dirt burying Sheriff Boone. "Enough," Holt said. Two quiet words that fell like heavy stones into still water. The youngest of Declan's men, a kid eager to carve out a bloody reputation, went for his gun. Holt's draw wasn't a frantic grab. It was an absolute clarification. With a flick of his wrist, the heavy Colt cleared the frayed rawhide holster in a blur. His gun roared before the boy's hammer ever fell. The bullet shattered the kid's hand, sending his pistol spinning into the dust. It wasn't luck. It was the cold geometry of a man who had made that shot 1,000 times. The second man, a scarred buffalo hunter, instantly swung his rifle toward Holt. Before Holt could pivot, a deafening crack tore through the square from above. The veteran collapsed, a heavy Winchester round buried in his shoulder. Holt didn't have to look up at the roof of the Mercantile to know who fired it. Jane hadn't stayed on her porch. She had followed him into the jaws of hell, racking another round into her rifle, providing covering fire from the high ground. But the distraction cost them a fraction of a second. The third enforcer, the most injurious killer of the bunch, already had his revolver leveled dead at Holt's chest. He smiled, knowing Holt couldn't adjust his angle in time. "You're dead," the killer whispered, and pulled the trigger. The third enforcer pulled the trigger, anticipating the deafening roar of a point-blank kill. Instead, there was only the hollow, sickening click of the hammer falling on a dead primer. Desert dust had fouled the mechanism, the arbitrary cruelty of a dry land that finds its way into everything, ruining the bullet. Before the killer could pull the trigger a second time, Holt closed the distance in a heartbeat. With ruthless precision, Holt drove the heavy steel barrel of his Colt deep into the inside of the man's wrist, crushing the bones and sending the revolver clattering into the dirt. But Declan was no coward, and he was no fool. His Smith & Wesson was already drawn. The syndicate boss fired, the gunshot tearing through the dust and slamming into Holt's ribs. Holt staggered, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. Blood instantly blossomed across his faded canvas coat. "On the roof!" Jane screamed, racking the lever of her Winchester in a panic. But the hammer fell on an empty chamber. She was out of ammunition. Declan leveled his gun for a second, fatal shot, his eyes cold and calculating. But Holt didn't fall. Propelled by sheer, agonizing willpower, he lunged forward through the acrid smoke. Before Declan could react, Holt jammed the searing hot barrel of his Colt directly beneath Declan's chin. The plaza fell into a dead, ringing silence. Holt stood there, bleeding heavily into the Texas dirt, his scarred finger trembling on the hair trigger. Declan slowly lowered his weapon, dropping it to the ground. He realized that all the money and power in Fort Worth meant absolutely nothing to a man who had already accepted death. Holt gasped for air, his dark eyes locked on the syndicate boss. "Dig him out," he rasped, nodding toward the mound of earth. With 3 enforcers incapacitated and a gun to his head, Declan sank to his knees in the dirt. He used his bare hands to dig into the fresh mound of earth, frantically clawing away the soil to free Sheriff Boone, because the shovels were completely out of reach. It took agonizing minutes before Boone finally emerged from the grave, violently coughing and gasping for the scorching air, his wrists still bound. The battle was over. The syndicate was broken, their legal threats crumbling the moment real blood soaked the plaza. The bruised and battered sheriff slumped against a wooden post, clutching his broken arm. He looked up at the bleeding drifter, who had single-handedly dismantled the devil's grip on Lone Tree. Jane scrambled down from the Mercantile roof, her hands trembling as she rushed across the square to Holt's side. She pressed her scarf against the gunshot wound in his ribs, her eyes searching his for a sign that he would survive. Boone struggled to his feet. "Do you have a name?" the old lawman asked, his voice raw from the dirt. Holt looked at the sheriff, then down at the woman holding on to him, like he was the only anchor left in the world. "Keep it," Holt replied softly. In the stories they tell in dime novels, the lone gunslinger always rides away into the sunset. But Holt didn't turn his dark roan stallion toward the eastern trail. He limped back to the ranch, leaning heavily on Jane's shoulder as the town of Lone Tree slowly opened its doors to breathe again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the scarred land, Holt unbuckled his worn rawhide gun belt. He draped it over the wooden porch railing, leaving the violence behind. With his good hand, he picked up the splitting axe. The war was over. I was finally home. If this story of frontier survival and a second chance at love kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to show your support. Every like helps us bring more gritty, cinematic Western tales to life. Have you ever wondered what you would fight for if you had nothing left to lose? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next journey into the wild, unforgiving American West. The trail doesn't end here. Disclaimer. This is a fictional cinematic Western romance, frontier survival story inspired by life on the 19th century American frontier. Characters, events, dialogue, and dramatic situations are entirely created for storytelling purposes. While historical settings, land disputes, and cultural details are researched for authenticity.